The morning fog had not yet lifted from the cobblestones of Market Square when Thaddeus Ravencroft brought his horse to an unhurried stop at the edge of the old district. He had not intended to stop at all. He had been riding since before
I have something
sunrise,
for you.
a habit born not of
What is it?
discipline,
A
but of
token of my
necessity.
affection.
The kind of necessity that had no name but pressed against the inside of his chest like a hand that would not release. Sleep had become a country he no longer knew how to reach. The roads of Newport at dawn were the only remedy he had found that came close to peace. He should have turned left at the crossroads, should have ridden past the square, past the flower stalls and the bread carts and the noise of a city waking, and continued south toward Windermere Estate, where a stack of correspondence waited for him on the mahogany desk in his study. Correspondence he would read and answer and file with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned long ago that duty was the only structure that kept him standing upright. He should have turned left. He did not. Something made him pull the reins. Something quiet and sharp at the same time. An instinct with no clear source, the way a man sometimes stops walking without knowing why, only to find he has avoided a step that was not there. Thaddeus's eyes moved across the square slowly, the way they always moved across any space he entered. Cataloging, measuring, deciding. The bread cart near the fountain. The elderly woman selling lavender bundles at the corner. Two young merchants arguing over the price of something he could not see. A child chasing a dog between the legs of everyone who passed. And then his breath stopped. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a visible shudder. It stopped the way a clock stops. Suddenly, completely, with no warning and no sound. One moment there was air in his lungs, the next there was not. She was standing at the jeweler's table near the east wall of the square. Her back was to him. He could not see her face, and yet he knew. He knew the way a man knows the shape of something he has memorized in the dark. Not by seeing it, but by the specific weight it placed on the world around it. The way she stood, her spine straight despite everything her posture was quietly carrying. The pale blue of her dress, simple cotton, nothing like what she used to wear. The dark hair pinned at the back of her neck with a single ribbon that had come slightly loose on one side. A small, undone thing she would have fixed immediately if she had known, because Evangeline Pembroke had always been precise about such things. Evangeline. 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and some number of days he had stopped counting because counting had not helped. Thaddeus sat entirely still on his horse and he watched. She was placing something on the jeweler's table. Her hands moved carefully, too carefully, with the deliberate steadiness of someone fighting not to let their hands shake. The jeweler, a stout man with spectacles and a gray waistcoat, leaned forward to examine what she had placed before him. Thaddeus watched the man pick it up, turn it, hold it toward the thin morning light. Pearl earrings. Even from this distance, even through the fog and the noise of the market and the 3 years of silence between them, Thaddeus recognized them. His jaw tightened. He knew those earrings. He had been in the room the day her father gave them to her. Leopold Ashford, 2 weeks before the illness took his ability to leave his bed, had called Evangeline into his study and pressed them into her hands with fingers that already trembled. "They were your grandmother's," he had said. "She was the bravest woman I ever knew. I want you to have them." Thaddeus had been standing by the window. He had not been meant to witness it. He had been there for other reasons. Reasons that lived in a different part of that memory. A part he was not prepared to open this morning. He watched Evangeline listen to the jeweler's offer. He watched something move through her shoulders. Not a flinch exactly. Something quieter. Something she absorbed rather than showed. She nodded once. Thaddeus's hand tightened on the reins. No. The word formed in his mind with the force and clarity of something that had always been true. Something that had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive at the surface. He dismounted before he had made any conscious decision to do so. The cobblestones were uneven beneath his boots. He was aware of the way the market shifted around him as he walked. The quick, involuntary straightening of postures. The lowered voices. The looks that darted away. He had grown accustomed to that effect long ago. The way a room or a street reorganized itself around the fact of his presence. He had never sought it. It had simply always been true. He reached the jeweler's table in less than a minute. The jeweler looked up first. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly behind his spectacles, and he straightened with the particular speed of a man who's just realized the social gravity of who is standing before him. "Mr. Ravencroft." Evangeline turned. For one long, suspended moment, the noise of the market seemed to pull back. Not disappear, but recede as though the square itself was giving the moment room. She looked at him. He looked at her. 3 years compressed into a single breath. She was thinner than he remembered. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there before. Not from illness, he thought, but from the particular exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time without setting it down. And yet she was still entirely undeniably herself. The set of her chin, the directness in her dark eyes, the way she did not look away from him even as something complicated moved across her face. He recognized it. The complication. He had seen it the last time they had stood in the same room, 3 years ago, at her father's funeral. She had looked at him across the nave of St. Mary's Church with an expression he had not been able to fully decode then, and he could not fully decode it now. Part of it was surprise. Part of it was something older. "Mr. Ravencroft," she said, her voice was steady. Whatever was happening beneath the surface of it, and something was, she had locked it behind a composure that would have fooled anyone who did not know her as precisely as he did. A pause. "I was not aware you had returned to Newport," she said. Her eyes moved briefly, very briefly, to the pearl earrings still sitting on the jeweler's cloth, and then back to him. Quickly. A tell she had not intended. "I understood you were still in Boston." "I returned last week," he said, "though I have been monitoring certain matters here for some months." The clarification was subtle, but it was there for her to understand that his absence from Newport had not meant absence of awareness. He glanced at the jeweler. Something in his expression, something that required no words, communicated itself with complete efficiency. The jeweler took one step back, found something extremely interesting to examine on the far side of his table, and became very occupied with it. Thaddeus looked at the earrings, then at her. "These belonged to your grandmother," he said. It was not a question. Something shifted in her face, just for a moment, a fraction of a second. The composure gave way to something raw, something that she closed again so quickly he might have imagined it, but he had not imagined it. "They are mine to do with as I choose," she said. Her voice was quiet, precise. "I do not believe the market at Newport falls under the jurisdiction of the Ravencroft estate, Mr. Ravencroft." "It does not," he agreed. A beat. "I would like to purchase them," he said. The air between them changed. Evangeline looked at him for a long, careful moment. The morning light fell across the left side of her face. The fog had begun to lift while they were standing there, and the pale gold of it touched the edges of everything in the square with a reluctant warmth. "They are not for sale to you," she said. "They are for to whoever offers the correct price." Thaddeus said, "I am offering it." "You do not know what price he offered." "I know it was not enough." Silence. Thaddeus, his name in her mouth. The first time she had used it since before the funeral. Since before the years of distance fell between them like something dropped from a height. She seemed to realize it a half second after she had said it because something moved in her expression. A flicker. "I did not come here for," she stopped, started again. "I do not require assistance." "I did not say you did." "Then what are you saying?" He looked at her for one moment longer than was necessary. One moment in which several things moved through him at once. The memory of her father's face. The words spoken in a room that smelled of leather and medicine, and the particular sadness of a man preparing to leave. The 3 years of silence that Thaddeus had chosen and could not entirely explain even to himself. "I am saying," he said, "that those earrings should not be here." He reached into his coat, placed the amount on the jeweler's cloth, more than the jeweler had offered. Considerably more. Without looking at the man. Then he picked up the earrings and held them out to her. Evangeline stared at them in his open palm. She did not take them. "You cannot simply," she began. "I already have," he said. She took them. Not because she wanted to. He could see that clearly enough. The tight, controlled movement of her hand. The way she closed her fingers around them without quite meeting his eyes. The single sharp breath she took through her nose that she would not have wanted him to notice. He noticed. "This changes nothing," she said very quietly. "I know," he said. She looked up at him then, directly, with all the complicated weight of everything that had not been said between them in 3 years, and before that and longer than that. "Why are you back?" she asked. "Truly." Thaddeus held her gaze. "Windermere Estate requires attention," he said. The North Wing has been neglected. The tenants have concerns I have been addressing by letter when I should have been addressing them in person. All of it true. None of it the whole truth. She seemed to understand that because she looked at him for one more moment, that measuring direct look that had always made him feel more visible than he was comfortable with, and then she turned away. "Good day, Mr. Ravencroft," she said. He watched her walk back across the cobblestones, her spine straight, the pearl earrings enclosed in her hand. He stood at the jeweler's empty table for longer than he should have. The fog had finished lifting. The market was loud and warm and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted in the architecture of Thaddeus Ravencroft's carefully maintained life. Something small and structural and irreversible. He turned back toward his horse. He had told himself 3 years ago that distance was the correct choice. He was no longer entirely certain he had been right. 7 years earlier, December 1888, the Ashford Mansion stood at the northern edge of Newport's most distinguished avenue, a three-story testament to old money and older principles. Thaddeus Ravencroft had been inside it exactly 12 times before that evening. Always for business. Always with Leopold Ashford, whose steel patents had made the Ravencroft fortune possible, and whose friendship Thaddeus valued above most things in his carefully ordered world. He was 24 years old. He had inherited his father's empire at 21 and spent 3 years proving to every skeptical board member and rival investor that youth was not synonymous with incompetence. He did not attend social events. He attended business dinners that happened to take place in ballrooms. But this was different. This was Leopold's annual Christmas gathering, and Leopold had asked him directly, and Thaddeus did not refuse Leopold Ashford when the man asked for something. So he found himself in the Ashford Library at 8:30 in the evening, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he had not touched, listening to three older gentlemen debate the merits of tariff reform with the passion of men who believed the fate of the Republic hung on their conclusion. He was preparing his exit strategy when she walked in. He noticed her the way he noticed everything, peripherally first. A figure in the doorway, dark green dress. Hair pinned up in a style that was fashionable but not frivolous. Then she spoke and his attention sharpened. "Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt what I'm certain is a fascinating discussion about import duties, but my father is asking for you in the drawing room. Something about cognac that cannot wait." Her voice carried the particular cadence of someone who had been educated well and was not afraid to use it. The three men looked up momentarily confused by the interruption, then rose with the collective efficiency of people who understood that Leopold Ashford's daughter was not to be ignored. They filed out. She remained. Thaddeus had seen an Evangeline Ashford before, from a distance, at her father's side during business meetings. Always quiet, always observing. He had formed an impression of her that was vague and general. Leopold's daughter, 18, perhaps 19, polite, unobtrusive. That impression disintegrated the moment she turned her full attention to him. "You look like you needed rescuing," she said. "I did," he admitted. "They've been having that same argument for 3 years. It never ends. I thought I'd spare you." "I'm grateful." She walked to the bookshelf nearest the window, running her fingers along the spines with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where everything was. "You're Thaddeus Ravencroft," she said. Not a question. "I am. My father speaks very highly of you. He says you're the only person under 30 who understands that industry is built on patience, not impulse. Your father is generous." "My father is precise. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She pulled a book from the shelf. Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Thaddeus felt something shift in his chest, small, tectonic. "You've read that?" he asked. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement, but close to it. "3 times, have you twice, then you're already ahead of most men in this city." She sat in the chair by the fire, crossing her ankles with the unconscious grace of someone who had been taught proper posture but didn't particularly care about it. "What did you think?" she asked. "Of Wollstonecraft? Of her argument? About women's education? About the idea that rational creatures deserve rational treatment regardless of their sex?" Thaddeus set his whiskey down on the side table. This was not the conversation he had expected to have tonight. "I think," he said carefully, "that she's correct. And I think most men are afraid of what that correctness implies, which is that they've been wrong for a very long time, about a great many things." Evangeline smiled then. not the polite smile of a hostess, the real one. The kind that changed her entire face. My father said you were intelligent. He didn't mention you were honest. The two are not always the same thing. No, she agreed, they're not. They talked for 2 hours about Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill, about the suffrage movement gaining momentum in England and stalling in America, about whether education was the path to equality or whether structural change had to come first, about philosophy and politics in the particular frustration of living in a world that valued your silence more than your thoughts. Thaddeus had spent 3 years in business negotiations with men twice his age. He had argued contract terms with lawyers trained at Harvard. He had debated economic policy with politicians who made their living on rhetoric. He had never once felt outmatched. Until now. Evangeline Ashford was 18 years old, and she argued like someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this conversation. She quoted sources he had read and ones he hadn't. She built her arguments with the precision of an engineer and the passion of someone who believed ideas mattered more than politeness. And somewhere in the middle of a point she was making about representative democracy and the tyranny of the majority, Thaddeus realized with a clarity that was almost physical that he was in serious trouble. He rode home in the dark 2 hours later. The December air was cold enough to sting, and the streets of Newport were quiet in the way they only were after midnight. He thought about the way she had looked at him when she made a point she particularly believed in. The slight lean forward, the intensity in her dark eyes, the complete absence of apology. He thought about the moment near the end when he had disagreed with her interpretation of Mill's harm principle, and she had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Finally, I was beginning to think you agreed with everything just to be polite." He thought about how she had stood when he left, offering her hand for him to shake like an equal, not a debutante. He reached Windermere Estate at 1 in the morning. He did not sleep. He sat in his study with the lamp burning low and acknowledged to himself what he already knew. He was completely lost. 4 years later, September 1892, the room smelled of medicine and autumn light. Leopold Ashford's study had always been Thaddeus's favorite room in the mansion. Leather and old books, in the particular quiet of a space where serious thinking happened. But today it smelled of something else too. The medicinal tinctures, the bitter herbs, the underlying scent of a body beginning its slow surrender. Leopold sat in his chair by the window, a blanket across his knees despite the warmth of the afternoon. He had lost weight. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for the glass of water on the table beside him. He was 58 years old and dying. Thaddeus had known for 3 months. The doctors had been clear. 6 months at most, probably less. Leopold had told him in this same room, in this same chair, with the same directness he applied to everything. "I'm dying, Thaddeus. I wanted you to hear it from me." And Thaddeus had sat across from him in the same chair he sat in now and had not known what to say. Because what did you say to the man who had been more of a father to you than your own father had managed to be in the years before his death? What did you say to the person whose friendship had been the only constant in a decade of constant change? You said nothing adequate. You said you were sorry and you meant it, and it was not enough. Now, 3 months later, Leopold looked at him with eyes that were beginning to lose their focus and said something Thaddeus was not prepared for. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm asking it because I trust you above every other man of my acquaintance." Thaddeus said, "Ask." Leopold was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the garden where the roses were beginning to turn brown at the edges. "Watch over Evangeline," he said. Simple words. The simplest possible words. Watch over Evangeline, not marry her, not love her. Though Thaddeus had already been doing that for 4 years without permission or announcement in the private and complicated way of a man who had decided that what he felt was not relevant because it could not go anywhere useful. Evangeline was 22. Brilliant. Entirely herself. She looked at him sometimes across dinner tables with an expression he could not interpret, and he had decided rationally correctly that he was reading things into expressions that were not there. She was Leopold's daughter. He was Leopold's friend. There were lines that civilized men did not cross. "Watch over her," Leopold said again. "She's strong, stronger than she knows. But this world was not built for women like her. Women who think, who question, who refuse to pretend." He turned from the window to look at Thaddeus directly. "I know you understand that. I know you see it in her. I've watched you these past years. The way you talk to her, the way you listen. Thaddeus felt something cold move through his chest. Leopold knew. Of course Leopold knew. Leopold Ashford had spent 40 years reading men across negotiating tables. He missed nothing. I'm not asking you to solve her life, Leopold continued. I'm asking you to be there, to be someone she can trust when she needs it, someone who sees her clearly. Thaddeus looked at this man who had given him friendship and wisdom and trust, and he said the only thing he could say, I will. Leopold nodded once, satisfied. Thank you. They sat in silence for a while. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a bird sang. She'll be fine, Leopold said quietly, more to himself than to Thaddeus. She's Leopold Ashford's daughter. She'll be fine. 6 weeks later, Leopold Ashford died. Thaddeus stood in the rain at his funeral and watched Evangeline stand beside the grave with a dignity that was almost unbearable to witness. She did not weep, not in front of anyone. She stood straight and still and accepted condolences with the composure of someone who understood that grief was private and funerals were public, and the two were not the same thing. Across the grave, their eyes met once. He wanted to go to her, to say something, to offer more than the formal words of sympathy he had given her in the receiving line. He did not. He told himself it was respect. It was propriety. It was cowardice. 4 months later, he received the announcement. January 1893. The envelope arrived at Windermere Estate on a Tuesday morning. Heavy paper, formal script. Thaddeus was in his study reviewing contracts when his secretary brought it in. He recognized Evangeline's handwriting on the address. He opened it. The words were printed in the formal language of wedding announcements. Traditional, impersonal. Miss Evangeline Ashford and Mr. Cornelius Pembroke announced their engagement. The wedding will take place at St. Mary's Church on the 15th of February, 1893. Thaddeus read it 3 times. He set it on his desk with the care of someone handling something that might break. Then he stood and walked to the window and looked out at the winter landscape and felt nothing and everything at the same time. She was marrying Cornelius Pembroke. Cornelius Pembroke was 40 years old, wealthy, respectable kind, in a distant sort of way. He was everything that made sense, everything that was safe, everything that was not Thaddeus Ravencroft. He had been so thoroughly certain that his silence, his restraint, his deliberate maintenance of the correct social distance between himself and Leopold's daughter had been the right choice. Honorable, controlled, proper. That the announcement of her engagement arrived like a cold correction. You waited, it said, and while you waited, she chose someone else. Thaddeus stood at that window for an hour. Then he sat down and wrote a letter of congratulations. Polite, warm, appropriate. He did not attend the wedding. He left for Boston the day before. He told himself it was business, unavoidable business. Contracts that required his presence. It was not business. It was the simple, cowardly fact that he could not stand in a church and watch Evangeline Ashford become Evangeline Pembroke and maintain the composure that his position required. So he left, and he stayed gone. For 3 years, the present, June 1895. The north wing of Windermere Estate smelled of dust and old fires and the particular silence of rooms that had been closed too long. Thaddeus walked through it alone that afternoon after returning from the market. No housekeeper, no steward, no one whose presence would require him to maintain the expression he wore in company. He moved through the covered furniture and the gray light and the ghost of every occasion these rooms had witnessed. And he did not think about the north wing. He thought about her face. He thought about the careful way she had taken the earrings, the controlled precision of it, the thank you she had not said, and the defiance that had stood in the place of it. Not rudeness, never that, but the self-possession of a woman who did not intend to be made into someone who owed a debt to Thaddeus Ravencroft. He stopped at the window at the end of the hall. From here on clear days, you could see across the valley to the low hills on the far side. And beyond them, though, it was too far to see the road that led to Rose Cottage, where Evangeline now lived, where she had been living since the death of Cornelius Pembroke. Her husband of 2 years, who had left her with 2 small estates to carry, in a set of accounts that Thaddeus, through certain quiet channels he had cultivated for reasons he had told himself were entirely practical, had discovered were considerably more disordered than anyone publicly knew. He had known about the accounts for 4 months. He had been monitoring the situation from Boston through his estate manager's reports, watching from a distance as the debts accumulated, as Holloway and Sons tightened their demands, As Evangeline managed with the meticulous desperation of someone who had not yet told anyone how bad it had become. And he had done nothing, because doing something required proximity, required returning to Newport, required facing what he had spent 3 years avoiding. But 4 months of knowing and doing nothing had finally become impossible. So he had returned. Last week he had stepped off the train at Newport Station and instructed his driver to take him to Windermere. And he had spent 7 days preparing, contacting his attorney, arranging the purchase of the Holloway debt, writing and rewriting a letter he could not quite bring himself to send. He pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass of the window and looked out at the valley. He had been 24 when her father called him into the study. He had been 24, and Leopold had been dying, and the room had smelled of medicine and autumn light, and the man had looked at him with eyes that were already beginning to lose their focus and had said those simple words. "Watch over Evangeline." And Thaddeus had said, "I will." And 6 weeks later, Leopold had died. And 4 months after that, Evangeline had married Cornelius Pembroke. Thaddeus turned away from the window. The memory of that morning, the morning he had received the announcement, standing in his study in Boston with a letter in his hand that said what it said in plain English, requiring no interpretation, was not one he examined often. Not because it had broken him. He had not allowed it to break him, but because it had shown him with a clarity that was almost clinical the precise distance between what he had wanted and what had been true. She had not needed watching over. She had needed nothing from him at all. He had waited, and she had chosen someone else. Now Cornelius was dead, and Evangeline was struggling. And Thaddeus had returned to Newport after 3 years because 4 months of knowing and doing nothing had finally become impossible. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. They were always steady. That was the problem. He had spent 7 years being steady, being disciplined, being correct. And steadiness had cost him everything that mattered. He walked back through the north wing to his study. The afternoon light was fading. The correspondence still sat on his desk unopened. He sat down, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, picked up his pen, and he began to write, not to his attorney, not to his estate manager, to her. He wrote it 4 times. The first version was polite, distant, asking if she needed assistance with estate matters. He tore it up. The second version was warmer, offering help, mentioning her father's memory. He tore it up. The third version said everything, all of it. 7 years of silence ending in one letter. He looked at it for a long time. Then he tore that up too. The fourth version was what he actually sent. Short, honest, incomplete. But more than nothing, he sealed it, addressed it, set it aside. Tomorrow he would find a way to deliver it, quietly, without ceremony. Tonight he sat in his study and looked out at the darkening valley and acknowledged to himself what he had been avoiding for 4 months. Distance, while perhaps honorable, had not been particularly useful. And he was done with distance. He was done with silence. 7 years was long enough to wait. It rained for 3 days after the market. Not the soft, apologetic rain of early summer, but a proper Newport rain. Gray and committed and entirely indifferent to anyone's plans. The roads to the old district became unreliable. The valley between Windermere Estate and the surrounding villages took on the particular closed quality of a landscape that has decided it would prefer to be left alone. Thaddeus spent those 3 days doing the things he should have been doing for months. Meeting with tenants, reviewing the North Wing accounts, writing letters to his attorney in Boston, including one that concerned Holloway and Sons, and was written with the careful indirectness of a man who did not want it to be immediately obvious what he was arranging or why. He did not ride past Rose Cottage. He made no attempt to engineer an encounter. He was not certain what he would say if he saw her again, and Thaddeus Ravencroft had a deep and long-standing aversion to entering situations without knowing what he was going to say. It was therefore entirely the rain's fault, or the fault of the particular pothole at the north end of Fenwick Road, which the rain had deepened into something considerably more dramatic than a pothole, when his horse stumbled on the afternoon of the 4th day. And Thaddeus found himself dismounting in front of a narrow gate in a stone wall that he recognized with a sharp and entirely unwelcome accuracy as the entrance to Rose Cottage. The horse was unhurt. Thaddeus checked with a thoroughness that the animal bore with mild irritation, then stood in the rain, holding the reins, assessing the road ahead, and concluding with the reluctant logic of someone who had been caught by circumstance rather than intention that the cottage gate was the nearest shelter. He pushed it open. The garden path was overgrown in places. not with neglect, but with the particular wildness of a garden that had been tended by someone who cared more about flowers than symmetry. He reached the door, knocked, waited. She answered it herself. This struck him. The absence of a housekeeper at the door. The immediate appearance of her own face when the knock sounded. She had clearly not been expecting anyone. There was a small ink stain on her right hand and she was still holding a pen. And her expression when she opened the door and found him standing in her rain-soaked entrance had the quality of someone whose face has run out of rehearsed responses. Mr. Ravencroft, she said, my horse, Thaddeus said, encountered the road. She looked past him at the horse who was standing with the air of an animal that considered the whole situation beneath comment. He appears uninjured, she said. He is. The road, however, that has made the ride back to Windermere inadvisable for the next hour. I apologize for the intrusion. A beat. She stepped back. Come in. The interior of Rose Cottage was small and warm, and nothing like what Thaddeus remembered of her life in Newport society or at her father's estate, and yet it was entirely recognizably hers. Books stacked at angles that suggested they were actually being read rather than displayed. A small fire in the grate that cast the sitting room in amber and shadow. On the writing desk near the window, an open letter beside a ledger, both of which she crossed the room to close before he had a chance to see them. A movement so quick and controlled that he pretended not to notice it. He pretended very convincingly. She gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. He sat. She remained standing for a moment with the look of someone recalibrating their afternoon, and then sat in the chair opposite. The rain against the windows was the only sound. Thaddeus looked at the room. Really looked. In the way he had learned to read spaces rather than just occupy them. The small economies visible in the details. The candles that had been burned well down before being replaced. The single vase on the mantel with dried flowers rather than fresh. The ledger she had closed. The ink on her hand that suggested she had been working on correspondence before he arrived, and that the correspondence had been the kind that required crossing things out. You do not need to be careful about looking, Evangeline said. He glanced at her. She was watching him with the directness she had always possessed. Unsettling, he had always found it, in the specific way of something that refuses to let you keep your distance. I know you have already noticed everything worth noticing. You always did. I was not. You were, she said, not unkindly, simply as a statement of fact. He said nothing. She rose and moved to the side table where a tray had been set. She poured 2 cups of tea with the steady efficiency of someone who had long since stopped waiting for help with anything, and brought one to him without asking whether he wanted it. He took it. Their fingers did not touch. The space between them when she withdrew her hand was nonetheless something he was aware of in a way that was disproportionate to its physical dimensions. You have been managing things alone, he said. I have been managing things well, she said, sitting again with the tea in both hands. Those are different statements. Are they? Yes. She met his gaze. One is a fact, the other is a judgment. He considered this. Holloway and Sons, he said. The air changed. It was subtle, a slight shift in the set of her shoulders, a fraction of stillness in her face that was different from the controlled composure she had been maintaining. He had been watching for it, and he saw it. And he had enough decency to regret briefly that he had used it. How do you know about that? She asked. Her voice was still even. Barely. My estate manager handles certain accounts in this district, he said. The letter came to him by misdirection. I do not believe it was intentional. A silence. I see, she said. Evangeline. She looked at him sharply at the use of her first name. You have no obligation here, he said. I want to be clear about that. Whatever you believe I owe to your father's memory, or to the county, or to any other abstract principle, it does not extend to my private financial circumstances. I am managing them. With your grandmother's earrings. The words were quiet, not an accusation. Just the truth placed between them. She looked at him for one moment. Just one. Just long enough for him to see it. Something behind her composure shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Like light changing direction. That was one solution to one specific problem, she said. There are others. I know, he said. I would like to discuss them with you. Why? He looked at her across the amber firelight. At the ink on her hand and the closed ledger and the controlled dignity of a woman who had been carrying something heavy and alone for a very long time. And he thought about how to answer that question honestly without answering it completely. Because I made a promise, he said, that I have not adequately kept. Evangeline set her teacup down. She looked at him for a long, careful moment. What promise? She asked. And Thaddeus, who had spent 3 years deciding that some things were better left unspoken, and who was beginning to understand the precise cost of that decision, said to your father. The rain went on. The fire crackled and settled, and Evangeline Pembroke sat very still across from him, with an expression that held beneath its surface, beneath the composure. She would not surrender the shadow of a question she had not yet asked. He could see her deciding whether to ask it. He found himself, for reasons he could not have explained to anyone, hoping that she would. He left when the rain softened enough to make the road passable. Evangeline stood at the window and watched him go, watched the broad set of his shoulders and the controlled ease of how he mounted, the unhurried way he turned his horse toward the road, as though departing was a simple thing that required no particular effort. She had known Thaddeus Ravencroft for 7 years. She had spent 7 years being intermittently certain that she understood him, followed by the particular humiliation of discovering that she had not. A promise to your father. She turned away from the window. The fire had burned lower. The sitting room was darker now and quieter, and she was alone with the closed ledger on the desk and the dried flowers on the mantel and the sound of the rain finishing itself against the glass. She crossed to the desk. She did not open the ledger. Instead, she stood with both hands flat on the surface of it and looked at nothing in particular, and let herself feel for precisely 60 seconds the full weight of what it had cost her to sit across from Thaddeus Ravencroft in this small warm room and speak evenly and hold her tea with steady hands and not ask the one question that had been living in the back of her mind for 3 years. Why did you stay away? He had been her father's most trusted friend. He had stood in the church at her wedding with a face that was entirely closed, entirely polished, entirely unreadable. The face he presented to the world when the world was not to be trusted with whatever he was actually thinking. She had seen that face many times. She had spent years learning to read the geography of it, and she had spent 3 years telling herself that what she thought she had seen in the moments before he had perfected that blankness had been a projection, a mistake. The wishful thinking of a woman who had been about to marry a man she did not love and was looking for reasons to believe there was something else available to her. She had been practical. She had done what was sensible. She had married Cornelius Pembroke, who was kind in a distant sort of way, and who had promised stability, and she had made herself content with stability for 2 years. And then Cornelius had died and left her the stability in ruins. And she had stood at his graveside in January rain and felt beneath the grief for a man she had respected, if not loved, the particular cold clarity of a woman who has run out of practical choices. She opened the ledger. The numbers were what they were. She had been over them enough times to have them memorized, and memorizing them had not changed them. But she went over them again anyway, because it was more productive than thinking about the way Thaddeus had said, I made a promise that I have not adequately kept, in a voice that had contained something underneath it she could not name. She was on the third column when she found the letter. It had been placed folded, sealed with plain wax, no crest inside the back cover of the ledger. She did not know how it had gotten there. She had not put it there. The ledger lived on this desk and nowhere else. And the only person who had been in this room today, other than herself, was she picked it up. Her name was written on the front in a hand she recognized instantly, because it was the hand of a man who wrote as he spoke. Precise, economical, nothing wasted. Mrs. Evangeline Pembroke. She stared at it. She turned it over. The seal was unbroken. She thought about not opening it. She opened it. Mrs. Pembroke, I have written this letter 4 times. The previous 3 versions were more articulate. This one is merely honest. I am not writing to address the matter of the Halloway account. I have taken steps in that regard, and they do not require your approval, though I understand that will concern you, and I ask only that you allow me to explain before you object. I am writing because this morning at the market you asked me why I returned. I gave you an answer that was true but incomplete. Windermere does require attention. The tenants do have concerns. Both of these things are real, but they are not why I came back. I came back because 4 months ago I received information about your circumstances, and I sat with it for 4 months without doing anything, and I could not continue to justify that inaction. not to your father's memory, and not to myself. You will note that I am still not telling you the whole of it. I am aware of that. I am telling you only what I am able to tell you in a letter which is less than everything and more than nothing. I will call on you tomorrow if you will permit it. There are practical matters to discuss that are better discussed in person. I remain, as I have always been, yours, T. Ravencroft. Evangeline read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the desk with a care that was disproportionate to the lightness of the paper. As I have always been, she pressed two fingers to her mouth. As I have always been yours. She looked at those words for a long time. She thought about everything they could mean and everything they might not mean, and the dangerous, inadvisable warmth that had moved through her chest when she had read them. A warmth she recognized. Because it was not new. Because she had been managing it with varying degrees of success for most of the 7 years she had known him. She thought about practical matters. She thought about tomorrow. She folded the letter along its original crease and held it in both hands and looked at the fire. Not the whole of it, he had said. She wondered what the whole of it was. She was afraid, and it was a specific kind of afraid, the kind that lives right next to hope that she already knew. He arrived at 10 o'clock, precisely 10. Not 1 minute early, not 1 minute late, which was so entirely Thaddeus that Evangeline had almost smiled when she heard the knock and checked the clock on the mantel. She had spent the morning reminding herself of several important facts: that she was a widow of 25 with obligations and responsibilities and very little room for the kind of thinking she had been doing since she read that letter. That Thaddeus Ravencroft was heir to one of the largest fortunes in New England, with a position in society and any number of far more suitable options for the application of his attention. That as I have always been yours could be read in a perfectly conventional epistolary sense by anyone who was not actively looking for another meaning in it. She had been moderately successful at reminding herself of these things. She was less successful the moment she opened the door. He was wearing dark blue, the coat of a man who had dressed with attention and chosen not to be obvious about it, which was so precisely him that the warmth in her chest arrived before she had given it permission. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She stepped back to let him in. She had made the decision somewhere between midnight and dawn that she was going to address the letter directly. She was not going to be indirect about it, or pretend she had not read it, or perform an ignorance she did not possess. That had been a habit of her younger self. The careful social navigation of a woman who had been taught that directness was a liability. She had spent 2 years being married to a man who had appreciated her composure and had no idea what it was containing, and she had emerged from that marriage with a revised relationship to her own silences. She was not going to be silent about this. She waited until they were both seated in the sitting room tea again, the same chairs, the fire lower in the morning light, and then she said, "I found the letter." Thaddeus had the particular stillness of a man who had expected this and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I thought you might," he said. "You left it deliberately." "Yes. In my ledger. It seemed less confrontational than handing it to you directly." "It was not less confrontational," she said. "No," he agreed. "I realize that now." A pause. "You said you have taken steps regarding the Holloway account," she said. "What step?" "I have instructed my attorney to purchase the debt," he said. "The arrangement will be renegotiated under terms that are considerably more—" A slight pause. "Reasonable." Evangeline looked at him. "Thaddeus," she said very carefully, "you cannot simply purchase my debt." "It is done," he said. "I recognize that presents you with a different problem. It presents me with several." "I know," he said. He held her gaze. "I know what it costs you to receive this kind of help. I know what independence means to you. I have known you for 7 years, and in 7 years I have never once seen you ask for anything you felt you could obtain by yourself." He paused. "That is not a criticism. It is the reason I put the letter in the ledger rather than standing here telling you what I had done. I wanted you to have time to be angry before I arrived." She stared at him. "That is," she said after a moment, "a very specific kind of manipulation." "It is," he said. "I am not proud of it." "And yet you did it." "Yes." She looked at him, really looked, with the direct searching attention she had always given him and that he had always received with a wariness she had never entirely understood. "What is the whole of it?" she asked. He did not pretend not to understand the question. For a moment he was quiet, not the silence of a man stalling. Thaddeus Ravencroft did not stall, but the silence of a man choosing with care where to begin. When your father called me into his study, he said the week before he died, he asked me to watch over you. I know, she said. He told me he had spoken to you. Something shifted in Thaddeus's expression. Slightly. He told you. He said he had asked you to keep an eye on things. She watched his face. He did not tell me what you said. I said yes, Thaddeus said. And then I married Cornelius, she said. And I went to Boston. A beat. Yes, he said, for 3 years. Yes. That is not, she said quietly, what I would call watching over someone. He looked at her. The morning light was full through the windows now, and it lay across the sitting room with the honest clarity of a day that had decided to be without softness. She could see the precise quality of what was in his face, the thing he had been keeping behind the discipline and the controlled courtesy. And she had been right. She had been right about what it was. She had not been projecting. She had not been inventing meaning and expressions. No, he said, it is not. Then why? She asked. Her voice was even. She had worked hard for that evenness, and she was proud of it. And she was also aware that it was barely containing something that had been waiting a very long time. Why did you go? Thaddeus set his teacup down. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has decided that a door he has kept closed for a long time is going to be opened, and that he is going to open it with the same control he applies to everything else, because it is the only way he knows how. Because watching over you, he said, from a distance close enough to be useful, required a kind of discipline I was not certain I possessed. Silence. The fire. The light. The sound of a bird somewhere outside. Thaddeus, she said, I am not. He stopped. Started again. I am not saying this to complicate your situation further. I am aware that your situation is already complicated. I am saying it because you asked me directly, and because I have spent 3 years giving you incomplete answers, and because your father asked me to be someone you could trust, and I cannot be that person while also being dishonest. Evangeline looked at him. Her hands were very still in her lap. How long, she asked. 7 years, he said quietly. Since the winter of 1888, since your father's Christmas dinner, when you argued with me about Wollstonecraft for 2 hours and I rode home in the dark realizing I was completely lost. She absorbed this. It took a moment. She thought about the wedding, about the expression she had not been able to read across the nave of St. Mary's that she had spent 2 years telling herself was professional courtesy and 4 months beginning to wonder about. She thought about the 7 years of dinners and social events and long conversations over her father's library table, all the moments in which something had been present that neither of them had named. You never said anything, she said. No. Why not? His jaw tightened slightly. The smallest movement. The tell of a man touching a wound he had not expected to reach this quickly. Because I decided, he said, that what I felt was not relevant unless it could be of use. And I could not determine a version of it that was of use. So I said nothing. So you said nothing. So I said nothing. And I, she said slowly, interpreted your silence as, she stopped. As what, he asked. She looked at him. As absence of feeling, she said, which led me to conclude that the most practical choice available to me was to accept Cornelius's offer. The quiet that followed was not comfortable. It was the quiet of two people looking at the same thing from opposite sides, and understanding at the same moment that the shape of it was very different from what either of them had thought it was. We were both, Thaddeus said, very practical. We were, she agreed, a beat. And very foolish, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. And then for the first time since he had found her at the jeweler's table, for the first time since the fog and the pearls and the 3 years of silence, something in her face softened. Not capitulated. Softened. In the specific way of a woman who has been carrying her guard for a long time and has just decided to set it down. Not because the danger is gone, but because she has determined that the person across from her is worth the risk. Yes, she said, we were. He invited her to Windermere Estate 4 days later, not in any way that could be described as improper. A letter, correctly formal, extending an invitation to view the restoration plans for the North Wing, which she had some years ago expressed an opinion about during a dinner at her father's estate, and which Thaddeus had, for reasons he was no longer pretending were entirely architectural, thought she might like to see. Evangeline had read the letter twice. Then she had written back, I accept. Thursday at 2. She arrived in a carriage that was smaller and quieter than anything that should have been pulling up to Windermere's entrance, driven by a man who appeared to be the cottage's general factotum rather than a proper coachman. Thaddeus watched from the window of his study as she descended without waiting for assistance, looked up at the facade of the house with the considering expression of someone who had not been here in years and was recalibrating their memory of it, and then straightened her gloves and walked toward the front steps with the unhurried composure of a woman who intended to be entirely in control of this afternoon. He found himself almost smiling. He found that interesting. The North Wing tour was genuine. Thaddeus had the restoration plans spread on the library table, and he walked her through them with the attention of a man who was actually interested in the subject, which he was, because Thaddeus Ravencroft was incapable of performing interest he did not feel. And the restoration of the North Wing had been occupying a real portion of his consideration since his return to Newport. But it was also true that the way she engaged with the plans, pointing out things he had not considered, asking questions about the original construction that demonstrated she had been paying attention to this house over many years, made the afternoon expand in a way he had not anticipated. She remembered things about Windermere that he had forgotten. She remembered which window in the old morning room faced east and how the light came through it in the early hours. She remembered a crack in the plaster above the second landing that his father had refused to fix on the grounds that it gave the house character. She remembered, and this one arrived quietly without announcement, that the library table was the one at which he had been sitting when she was 14 years old and had come to Windermere with her father and had wandered in here and found him reading and had said with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to be diplomatic, "That book looks extremely boring." "Is it?" He had told her it was not boring and had explained to her at length why. She had stayed for 2 hours. He had not thought about that afternoon in years. He thought about it now, standing in the library with the afternoon light falling through the tall windows, and found that the memory carried a warmth he was not prepared to name. "You remember the east window," he said. "I remember everything about this house," she said simply, and then seemed to decide that was more than she had intended to reveal because she looked back at the plans with renewed attention. He let it pass. He almost didn't. They walked in the garden at 4 o'clock. The Windermere garden in early June was beginning to commit to summer. The formal beds were filling in. The roses were opening, cautious at first, then bolder. The hedges clipped to their traditional precision. But it was the kitchen garden along the south wall that had always been Evangeline's favorite, already green and purposeful. And they walked there in the low afternoon light, with the conversation that had been building all day, settling into something quieter and more honest than either of them had quite managed indoors. Evangeline stopped at the wall where the first roses had begun to push through. Small, tight buds, still mostly hidden, barely a suggestion of what they would become. "He used to talk about you," she said without preamble. Thaddeus stood beside her. "Your father," he said. "Yes." She was looking at the roses. "After your visits, he would say," she paused, selecting the memory, "he would say that you reminded him of what he hoped to have been at your age. Decided he called it. He admired that in you." "He was too generous," Thaddeus said. "He was not actually," she said. "He was precise. He did not say things he did not mean." She turned to look at him. "He told me once that he trusted you more than any other man he knew. He said it the way he said things that mattered, quietly, like they were simply facts." She paused. "I thought you should know that." Thaddeus looked at her. The light was low and warm, and it touched the side of her face with the particular gold of late afternoon. And he was standing close enough, not inappropriately close, just close, the natural proximity of two people who had stopped at the same point to look at the same thing, that he could see the slight unsteadiness in her breath. "Evangeline," he said. It was not a statement. It was not a question. It was simply her name, said in a way that was different from the measured way he had been saying it all afternoon. Different from the way he had said it at the market and in the cottage. It was her name said with everything underneath it, without the armor. She looked at him. He watched her decide. Not whether she felt what she felt. He could see that she did, and he thought she could see that he knew. But whether she was going to let it be real, whether she was going to step from the careful, practical distance they had both maintained for 7 years into the territory that had always existed just beyond it. Her hand was at her side. He reached out, slowly, slowly enough that she could have moved, could have chosen otherwise, and took it. Her fingers, after a single still moment, turned and held his. The garden was quiet. The roses were barely begun. I should have spoken, he said. Before the announcement, before any of it, I should have told you. Yes, she said. Her voice was not accusing, it was just true. You should have. I know. And I, she said quietly, should have asked instead of deciding I knew the answer. He looked at their joined hands, her pale glove, his darker one, the simple fact of the contact. What do we do now, she asked. He looked up. She was watching him with that direct, undefended gaze. The one that had always made him feel more visible than he was comfortable with, and that he had, over 7 years, come to understand was not a challenge, but an offering. She looked at people the way she looked at things she intended to understand. She was looking at him that way now. Now, he said, I would like if you are willing to begin again. Begin what specifically, she said. And there was something in it, just a thread of the old directness. The 14-year-old who had walked into his library and asked if his book was boring. That made it impossible not to feel something shift in his chest. Everything, he said, properly this time. Evangeline looked at him. The late light held them both. That, she said quietly, is the first entirely honest thing you have said to me since the market. No, he said, it is the first entirely honest thing I have said to you in considerably longer than that. She was quiet for a moment. Then all right, she said, begin again. He reached up, tucked the loose strand of hair, the same one that had come undone at the market, the same small undone thing, back from her face. His fingers barely touched her cheek. She went very still. Not the still of discomfort, the still of a woman paying complete attention to a single point of contact. The way you are still when something you have been waiting a long time for finally arrives and you do not want to move and end it. I have wanted to do that, he said, quietly, since the market. Only since the market, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. No, he said, not only since the market. She turned her face toward him. They were close, closer than they had been in the cottage, closer than the sitting room visits and the library plans had allowed. Close enough that she could see the precise dark blue of his eyes and the slight tension at the edge of his jaw that she recognized as the last of his restraint. Thaddeus, she said. Yes, he said, not answering a question, just yes, to everything. He kissed her, not quickly, not with the urgency of something contained too long, though it had been, not with haste or desperation. He kissed her the way he did most things, with complete, controlled, deliberate attention. His hand at the side of her face, her breath catching at the first touch and then settling into it, settling into him, her hand rising to his lapel and closing there. It was not a long kiss. It did not need to be long to be everything. When he drew back, she kept her eyes closed for one moment. Just one. And he watched her face in that moment with the quiet intensity of a man committing something to permanent memory. Then she opened her eyes. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. We were, she said, extraordinarily foolish. We were, he said. I more than you. Considerably more, she agreed, and this time the smile arrived fully. The real one. The one he had seen across dinner tables and garden paths and library afternoons for 7 years, and had never once allowed himself to respond to correctly. It changed her face entirely. It made her look like herself, the self beneath the composure, the one she kept for people she trusted. She was giving it to him. He felt the weight of it land exactly where it was meant to. You owe me 7 years of honesty, she said. I intend to pay them, he said. She looked at him. All at once or in installments? Whichever you prefer, he said. I am at this point prepared to be extremely accommodating. That, she said, is very unlike you. I know, he said. I thought it was time to try something different. She laughed, softly, warmly. The laugh of a woman who has finally set something heavy down and discovered that her arms still work perfectly well. Her head tilted against his shoulder, a small, natural movement, as though it had always been the right place for it to go. His hand very gently covered hers. The rain had stopped. The garden was warm with approaching evening, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And the silence was the best kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. The invitation to Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's annual summer ball arrived at Windermere Estate on a Monday morning in late June. Heavy cream paper, formal script, the kind of invitation that carried the weight of Newport society behind it. Thaddeus stood at his desk and looked at it for longer than was necessary. He thought about what it would mean for Evangeline to attend, the questions that would follow a widow's reappearance in society, the particular attention that would be directed at a woman alone without protection or alliance navigating an event at which half of Newport would be present and all of Newport's tendency toward observation would be active. He thought about what it would mean if he was there too. He sat down and wrote a note, short, direct. Will you attend Mrs. Blackwood's ball? I should be glad to know. Her reply arrived the following morning. I had not planned to, but I find myself reconsidering. He stood at his desk and read those 7 words longer than was necessary. Then he went to find his evening clothes. The Blackwood mansion stood at the southern edge of Newport's most prestigious avenue, a monument to Gilded Age excess dressed in the language of restraint. Thaddeus arrived at 8. He had been into the ballroom for approximately 4 minutes when Mrs. Blackwood appeared at his elbow with the specific speed of a woman who had been watching the door. Mr. Ravencroft, she said, what a surprise. We had not expected you this season. I have returned to Newport, Thaddeus said. It seemed appropriate to attend. Mrs. Blackwood was a woman of 50 with sharp eyes and the social precision of someone who treated information as currency. She smiled the smile of a person assembling a picture. And will we be seeing much of you this season? She asked. Or is this a brief visit? I have not yet determined the length of my stay, he said. This was not entirely true. He had already instructed his estate manager to proceed with plans for the North Wing that would take the better part of a year. He had already notified his attorney in Boston that correspondences should be redirected to Windermere as his primary address for the foreseeable future. He had not told anyone this. He was telling himself it was because plans could change. He was aware that this was not the actual reason. He saw Evangeline at 8:20. She entered from the far end of the room, alone, in pale green silk with her dark hair dressed simply and the pearl earrings at her ears. And something in the careful deliberateness of her composure that told him this had cost her something. Not the dress or the earrings, the act of being here. The decision to walk into a room full of people who knew her circumstances and to stand in it without apology. He watched several heads turn. He watched the quality of the turning. The quick assessments, the murmured exchanges behind fans, the particular social mathematics of a room recalculating the significance of a widow's reappearance. He crossed the room, not quickly. Quickly would have been noticed and interpreted, at a pace that was deliberate without being urgent. The pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had decided that anyone who chose to observe it was welcome to their interpretation. He reached her before anyone else could. Mrs. Pembroke, he said. She looked at him, a slight exhale, just barely visible, just enough to tell him that his arrival was a relief she had not let herself count on. Mr. Ravencroft, she said. He offered his arm. She took it, and the room with the collective efficiency of a social organism that had just received a clear and unambiguous signal reorganized itself accordingly. He felt the shift. Evangeline felt it too. He could tell by the fractional straightening of her posture, the settling of something in her shoulders. They walked the room together. He introduced her to the 3 people he thought would be useful for her to know, and kept her neatly away from the 2 he thought would not. She noticed all of it. He could tell because she was Evangeline and she noticed everything. And she said nothing about it except a single quiet remark when they paused near the tall windows that overlooked the garden. You are very good at managing a room. So are you, he said. You simply prefer not to. That is accurate, she said. He found himself again almost smiling. Mrs. Blackwood found them at 9:30 near the refreshment table, with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for a strategic moment. Mrs. Pembroke, she said warmly, how lovely to see you again. We were so sorry to hear of your circumstances. Such a difficult time. The warmth was real, which made what followed more effective. I do hope you are managing. There have been some concerns. I know the Rose Cottage accounts. One hears things. Mrs. Blackwood, Thaddeus said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Mrs. Blackwood stopped. He looked at her with the full, direct, entirely controlled attention of a man who has decided that this particular conversation is going to end here. Mrs. Pembroke's affairs, he said, are in excellent order. A pause, 1 beat, precisely measured. I would be reluctant to see otherwise implied. Mrs. Blackwood absorbed this. She was not a stupid woman. She understood what was being communicated, not just about Evangeline's finances. but about the fact of his standing here beside her, the arm he had offered at the door, the evening's visible allegiance. Of course, she said, of course, I only meant, I am certain you meant kindly, Thaddeus said, pleasantly. As you always do, Miss. Blackwood smiled with the precision of someone retreating in good order. Indeed, do excuse me. I see the Morrison party has arrived. She moved away. The silence that followed held several things at once. Evangeline looked at him. You did not have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. She will tell everyone. I know, he said again, a pause. Is that, she said slowly, what you intended? He looked at her. At the pearl earrings, in the pale green silk, in the composure that had tonight been carrying more than it usually had to. I told you, he said, that I intended to begin again. Properly. She held his gaze. Something moved through her expression. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite not surprise, and was entirely unmistakably a woman allowing herself to feel something she had been being careful about. You are, she said quietly, a very decisive man. So my father's portrait implies, he said, and she for the first time that evening, genuinely without the controlled composure in the way, laughed. 2 weeks later, a carriage appeared at Rose Cottage. Not Thaddeus's carriage. A newer one, polished black with brass fittings that caught the morning sun. Evangeline watched from the window as a man descended, tall, perhaps 35, handsome in the particular way of men who had been told so often enough to believe it. She did not recognize him. He knocked. She answered. Mrs. Pembroke, he said. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening for him. Marcus Thornton, I apologize for calling without notice. I was passing through Newport and heard you were in residence. She had not heard of Marcus Thornton. She said as much. I've recently acquired property, Mayor Bunker, he said. Railroad investments. I knew your late husband slightly, through business circles. This was a lie. Evangeline knew it immediately because Cornelius had never mentioned anyone named Thornton, and Cornelius had been meticulous about his business associations. But she was also a woman alone in a cottage with limited options for refusing a caller who had already crossed her threshold. She invited him in. He stayed for 20 minutes. He was charming, appropriately sympathetic about her circumstances, careful not to overstep. But there was something underneath the charm, something that felt like a negotiation disguised as a social call. A woman of your standing should not struggle alone, he said near the end of his visit. If you ever find yourself in need of assistance, financial or otherwise, I hope you will consider me a friend. He left his card. After he was gone, Evangeline stood in her sitting room and looked at the embossed name. Marcus Thornton, Railroad Development, Boston and Newport. She set it on the mantel and tried to ignore the cold weight that had settled in her chest. The weight that told her Marcus Thornton had not called because he was passing through Newport. He had called because someone had told him about a beautiful widow with old family connections and financial difficulties. And men like Marcus Thornton saw such things as opportunities. Thaddeus arrived that afternoon and knew immediately that something was wrong. Evangeline opened the door with a smile that was fractionally too controlled. You had a visitor, he said. It was not a question. She looked at him for a moment, then stepped back to let him in. Marcus Thornton, she said. He came this morning. Thaddeus went very still. What did he want? To offer his friendship and his assistance. Should I find myself in need of it? She handed him the card. Thaddeus looked at it, at the embossed lettering and the Boston address, and the particular arrogance of a man who printed his card on stock heavier than was necessary. He knew Marcus Thornton, not personally, but by reputation. New money, railroad speculation, aggressive business tactics that lived in the gray space between legal and not. A man who had made his fortune by identifying weakness and exploiting it with efficiency. He will try again, Thaddeus said quietly. I am aware, Evangeline said. I am also capable of refusing again. Thaddeus set the card down. He looked at her. At the controlled composure and the slight tension in her shoulders, in the very careful way she was not asking him what he thought she should do. Because Evangeline Pembroke did not ask men what she should do. She made her own decisions and lived with the consequences. He had always known that about her. He had always loved that about her. We should make this formal, he said, properly. She looked at him sharply. Are you suggesting this because of Marcus Thornton? I am suggesting this because I should have suggested it 7 years ago, he said. Thornton's appearance merely makes the timing more urgent than I would have preferred. But the intent has been there since the garden. She looked at him for a long moment. Then ask me properly, she said. Not because of him, because of us. 3 days, he said. Give me 3 days. Why 3 days? Because he said, I need to ensure that when I ask you, Marcus Thornton will no longer be a concern. That evening, Thaddeus sat at his desk and wrote 3 letters. The first was to his attorney in Boston. Marcus Thornton, Railroad Development. I need everything. Contracts, land, acquisitions, partnerships, debts, everything that exists in public record and everything that does not. You have 48 hours. The second was to a private investigator he had used twice before for matters requiring discretion. The same subject, the same timeline, different sources. The third was to a colleague in the state legislature. Thornton's name had appeared in connection with a rail contract under review. Thaddeus wanted to know why. He sent all 3 before midnight, then he waited. 40 hours later, a telegram arrived. Thornton stop. Fraud confirmed stop. Land acquisitions falsified. Stop. Rail contracts obtained through bribery. Stop. Evidence substantial stop. Recommend immediate action. Stop. Thaddeus sat at his desk and looked at the telegram for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not the controlled smile of social courtesy, the smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly this information. He had suspected, from the moment he heard Thornton's name, from the research he had quietly commissioned the day after the ball, when Thornton's interest in Evangeline had become clear. Men like Marcus Thornton did not make fortunes in railroads without cutting corners. The question had never been whether fraud existed, only where to find it. Thaddeus spent the next 4 hours reading through the documentation his attorney had compiled. Land deeds signed by officials who claimed they had never authorized the sales. Rail contracts awarded to Thornton's company despite lower bids from competitors. Payments made to state officials that were described as consulting fees, but followed a pattern that was unmistakable. It was thorough, it was damning, and it was exactly what Thaddeus needed. The following morning, Thaddeus sent a note to Marcus Thornton's hotel. Brief, formal. A request for a private meeting to discuss a business matter of mutual interest. Thornton agreed immediately. They met in Thaddeus's study at Windermere at 2 o'clock. Thornton arrived with the confidence of a man who believed he was being offered an opportunity, a partnership, an investment. He did not know Thaddeus Ravencroft very well. Mr. Ravencroft, Thornton said, extending his hand. A pleasure. I've heard excellent things about the Ravencroft enterprises. Thaddeus did not take his hand. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Thornton sat, still smiling, still confident. Thaddeus remained standing. I'll be direct, Mr. Thornton, he said. You called on Mrs. Pembroke 3 days ago. You offered her your assistance, your friendship. Thornton's smile widened. I did, a lovely woman, and in such unfortunate circumstances. I know what you thought, Thaddeus said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the particular kind of quiet that made smart men pay attention. Thornton was not a smart man. I thought perhaps we might discuss a partnership, Thornton continued. Mrs. Pembroke's late husband had connections that could be useful, and with your backing, I have no interest in a partnership with you, Thaddeus said. He placed a folder on the desk between them. What I have interest in is ensuring that you understand your situation clearly. Thornton looked at the folder, then at Thaddeus. I don't understand. You will. Thaddeus opened the folder, turned it so Thornton could see the first page. This is a land deed for property in western Massachusetts, signed by a county official named William Hargrove in 1893. The property was subsequently sold to your company for railroad development. Do you remember this transaction? Thornton's smile had begun to fade. I have many transactions. I can't be expected to remember. Mr. Hargrove has provided a sworn statement. Thaddeus continued that he never signed this deed, that his signature was forged, and that he has never received any compensation for property he claims he still owns. He turned to the next page. This is a rail contract awarded to your company by the state of Massachusetts in 1894, despite the fact that 3 other companies submitted lower bids. Would you like to know why your company was selected? Thornton was no longer smiling. This is absurd. I don't know what you think you found, but I have found, Thaddeus said, his voice still quiet, still controlled, evidence of fraud in land acquisitions across 3 states, evidence of bribery in the awarding of rail contracts, evidence of falsified documents and forged signatures. Evidence that if presented to the appropriate authorities would result in criminal prosecution. He closed the folder. You have two choices, Mr. Thornton. Thornton had gone white. This is about the widow. This is about justice, Thaddeus said. Mrs. Pembroke simply made it personal. He walked to the window, looked out at the valley. Your first choice, you leave Newport today. You never return. You never contact Mrs. Pembroke again. You sell whatever property you have acquired here, and you conduct your business elsewhere, preferably somewhere far from New England. He turned back to face Thornton. Your second choice, I deliver this evidence to the district attorney in Boston, and to the state legislature, and to every newspaper between here and New York. And you spend the next several years defending yourself in court, possibly in prison. The silence in the study was absolute. You cannot do this, Thornton said. But his voice had lost its confidence. Already him, Thaddeus said. He returned to his desk, sat down, looked at Thornton with the same controlled attention he had given him throughout the conversation. I am not a cruel man, Mr. Thornton. I am offering you a way to walk away from this, to salvage what remains of your reputation, to avoid prosecution. He paused. But make no mistake, if you do not take this offer, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that you face the consequences of your actions. Not because of Mrs. Pembroke, though I will not pretend that her situation did not motivate the timing of this investigation. Another pause. But because men like you believe that rules do not apply to them, that wealth and charm and confidence are sufficient to circumvent law and ethics, and I have spent my entire career proving that belief wrong. Thornton sat very still. Thaddeus could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the assessment of options, the realization that he had badly underestimated the man across from him. How long do I have? Thornton asked finally. You have until sunset tomorrow to be gone from Newport, Thaddeus said. You have 1 week to complete the sale of any property you own here. You have 1 month to provide me with written assurance that you will never contact Mrs. Pembroke again. He opened a drawer in his desk, removed a single sheet of paper, placed it in front of Thornton. This is an agreement to that effect. Sign it now. Thornton looked at the paper, then he signed it. His hand was shaking. We're done here, Thaddeus said. Thornton stood, walked to the door, stopped. She's not worth this, he said. Whatever you think she is, she's just a widow with debts and a dead husband's name. Thaddeus looked at him. You're right, he said quietly. You don't know what she's worth, and you never will. Thornton left. Thaddeus sat at his desk for a long time after the man was gone, looking at the signed agreement, at the folder of evidence, at the valley outside his window where 2 miles away, Evangeline was working in her cottage, unaware that the threat had been eliminated. He had told her 3 days. He had needed only 2. He went to Rose Cottage that evening. She answered the door and knew immediately from his expression that something had happened. Come in, she said. They sat in the sitting room. The fire was low. The evening light was fading. Thornton is gone, he said. She looked at him carefully. Gone? He left Newport this afternoon. He will not return. He will not contact you again. How do you know? Because I made it very clear what would happen if he did. She was quiet for a moment. What did you do? He told her. Not everything, but enough. The investigation, the evidence, the confrontation, the choice he had given Thornton. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. You investigated him, she said. Yes. You found evidence of fraud. Yes. You threatened him with prosecution. I offered him a choice. Prosecution was one option. Leaving was the other. And he chose to leave. He did. She was quiet again, longer this time. This is a very specific kind of protection, she said finally. It is, he agreed. Not because you think I cannot handle Marcus Thornton myself. No, I know you can. But because you will not allow anyone to threaten what is yours. She said it as a statement, not a question. He looked at her. What is mine, he asked. Mitai, she said. Our life, our future. He held her gaze. Equal in all things, she asked. Equal in all things, he said, which means I protect what we are building together. Not because you need protecting, but because partnerships mean that threats to one are threats to both. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, crossed the room, sat beside him. 7 years, she said quietly. You have been doing everything wrong, staying silent when you should have spoken, leaving when you should have stayed. She took his hand, and now you are doing everything right. She kissed him then, not because he had solved her problem, but because he had solved their problem. And because she had finally, after 7 years, found the partner she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. 3 days later, he asked her to come to Windermere. To see something, he said in the note. She came. He led her through the house to the garden, to the south wall where the roses had been cautious 2 weeks ago and were now fully committed to summer. They had opened all at once, deep pink and white, in the particular red that only came in the final days of June, as though they had agreed on a date and were determined to keep it. Evangeline stopped at the wall. Her hand rose to touch one of the blooms. Gently, the way you touch something you do not want to damage. They found themselves, she said. I merely noticed, he said. She looked up at him. The afternoon light was warm. The valley below was green and certain. The roses were doing their patient work along the wall. You look better than you did in February, she said. I feel better than I did in February. What changed? She knew what had changed. She simply wanted to hear him say it. You know what changed, he said. I do, she said. I want to hear you say it anyway. She tilted her head slightly, that precise, unhurried look she gave him when she wanted him to be honest. You are as I have observed in the process of practicing honesty. I am simply providing opportunity. How generous of you, he said. I thought so. He turned to face her fully. The garden was quiet around them, birdsong somewhere in the hedges, the distant sound of the valley, the roses doing their patient, beautiful work. He looked at her and felt with a clarity that required no management, no discipline, no careful maintenance of distance, the simple and enormous fact of what she was to him. Evangeline, he said, I have been in love with you for 7 years. I have been a fool about it for most of them. I have kept my distance when I should have crossed it, stayed silent when I should have spoken, and managed my feelings with a discipline that I now understand was not noble. It was simply afraid. He held her gaze. I am done being afraid of this. I am done being careful with it. I intend to stay in Newport. I intend to restore the North Wing. I intend to be here, precisely here, for as long as you will have me. He paused. And I would like if you are willing to make that formal, properly, with the full and complete honesty I should have offered you years ago. When the garden was very still, Evangeline looked at him, at the open, unguarded face of a man who had taken every wall he had ever built and set it down brick by brick over the course of one Newport summer. Are you, she said carefully, proposing to me beside a rose bush? I am proposing to you beside several rose bushes, he said. I thought the setting was appropriate. Her eyes were bright. You could have chosen the library or the ballroom or literally anywhere with a chair. I thought of the library, he admitted. Then I saw you standing here and I thought now, because I have spent 7 years waiting for the correct moment. And there is no correct moment. There is only the moment that is happening and the choice to speak or not to speak. And I have made the wrong choice too many times to make it again. She looked at him for one long, still moment. The June light lay across the garden in warm, unhurried gold. Yes, she said, one word. The simplest possible word. He exhaled, not dramatically, not with visible relief, but with the quiet release of a man setting down something he had been carrying for a very long time. His forehead dropped gently to hers. She closed her eyes. They stood there for a moment, just a moment, with the roses opening around them in the valley below, in the whole of Windermere behind them, patient and warm, and full of rooms that had been closed too long and were ready now to be opened. 7 years, she murmured. 7 years, he agreed. I intend to spend considerably more than that making up for them. She pulled back just enough to look at him. You realize, she said, that I am going to remind you of this moment. Every time you are being too controlled and too composed and too thoroughly yourself. I am counting on it, he said. She smiled. The full, real, unguarded smile that changed her face and always had. And he kissed her there in the garden, among the roses that had finally decided to open. It was not their first kiss. It was in every way that mattered their first real one. The first one without fear behind it, without 3 years of silence pressing against it, without the old, careful distance waiting to reassert itself the moment they stepped apart. When they drew back, she was still smiling. And Thaddeus Ravencroft, a man of discipline and reserve, and precisely maintained composure, smiled back, fully, without management, for the first time in 7 years. The wedding took place at St. Mary's Church on the 15th of September. Small, intimate, nothing like the grand society event Newport had expected. Evangeline wore ivory silk, simple lines, no unnecessary ornamentation, the pearl earrings at her ears. Thaddeus stood at the altar and watched her approach down the aisle, and thought about all the years he had wasted being careful, being correct, being afraid, and decided that this moment, this single perfect moment, was worth all of it. The Reverend spoke the traditional words, but the way Evangeline looked at Thaddeus when she said, "I do," made them new. And the way Thaddeus looked at her when he said the same voice, his steady eyes never leaving hers, made them true. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said. Thaddeus lifted her veil slowly, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her like he had all the time in the world, which he did now. The congregation murmured approvingly. So, Blackwood, sitting in the third pew, leaned to her companion and whispered, "It is the most romantic thing Newport has seen in years." For once, no one disagreed. That night in the master bedroom of Windermere Estate, with the windows open to the September air and the sound of the ocean in the distance, Thaddeus and Evangeline began the first night of a marriage that had taken 7 years to arrive at. He unlaced her dress with the same careful attention he applied to everything, slowly, deliberately, as though each moment mattered because it did. She turned in his arms when the last of the silk fell away, looked at him in the lamplight. 7 years, she said softly. 7 years, he agreed. Then let us not waste another moment. What followed was tender and urgent and entirely theirs, the kind of intimacy that comes not from experience but from trust, from knowing that the person in your arms sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. Afterwards, she lay with her head on his chest, his hand moving slowly through her hair in a rhythm that was almost meditative. "I used to wonder," she said quietly, "what it would be like if you had spoken 7 years ago. And and now I think perhaps we needed those 7 years to become the people who could do this right." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is a generous interpretation of my cowardice." "It is not generosity," she said. "It is truth. I was not ready at 18, or even at 22. I needed to learn who I was outside of my father's house, outside of anyone's expectations." She lifted her head to look at him. "And you needed to learn that discipline is not the same as strength, that vulnerability is not weakness." He looked at her in the lamplight, at the woman who had always seen him more clearly than he was comfortable with, and who had over 7 years taught him that being seen was not the same as being exposed. "How did you get so wise?" he asked. "7 years of watching you be stubborn," she said. And he laughed, actually laughed, the sound filling the room in a way that felt like light. October arrived with cooler mornings and the particular clarity that comes when summer admits defeat. Thaddeus and Evangeline settled into marriage with the ease of two people who had known each other long enough that the adjustment was minimal. They worked together in the mornings. Evangeline had opinions about the North Wing restoration that were better than his, and Thaddeus had learned over 7 years to recognize good ideas regardless of their source. She proposed a workers' education program, a small fund to help the estate employees improve their skills, to give them options beyond manual labor. It would cost approximately $5,000 annually, she said, showing him the calculations she had worked out. But the return on investment would be substantial. Educated workers are more productive, more loyal, more capable of taking on complex tasks. She had prepared charts, projections, comparative data from estates in England that had implemented similar programs. It was thorough, it was brilliant. It was exactly the kind of competence that made Thaddeus fall in love with her all over again every time he witnessed it. He implemented it within a week. "This is a partnership," he said when she thanked him. "Your ideas are as valuable as mine. More valuable in this case." She looked at him with an expression that was part surprise and part something warmer. "Equal in all things," she said quietly. "Equal in all things," he agreed. It became their phrase, the thing they said to each other when one of them needed reminding that this marriage was built on different principles than most. In November, they traveled to Boston, not for pleasure, for business, specifically to address the matter of Holloway and Sons. Thaddeus had purchased the debt, yes, but Evangeline had insisted that she be present for the renegotiation, that she'd be part of the conversation that determined the terms. I will not be a silent beneficiary of your generosity, she had said. I would never ask you to be, he had replied. They sat across from Jonathan Holloway in his office on State Street, a man of 60 with the particular hardness of someone who had spent 40 years in the business of other people's desperation. He looked at Evangeline with a dismissive assessment of a man who did not expect women to understand finance. That assessment lasted approximately 5 minutes. Then Evangeline began to speak. She laid out the terms she was proposing. Not asking, proposing, with the precision of someone who had spent the past month reviewing every clause and every precedent. She pointed out where Holloway's original terms had been predatory, where they had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of usury laws, where his firm had taken advantage of a widow's desperation. She did it without emotion, without accusation, simply as a recitation of facts. And then she proposed alternative terms, terms that would see the debt repaid in full, but over a timeline that was reasonable, at an interest rate that was legal, with provisions that protected both parties. You will receive full payment, she said, with interest that is fair and appropriate, over 7 years rather than 2, which means steady income for your firm rather than a lump sum that you would then need to reinvest. She slid a document across the table. I have also calculated the risk-adjusted return on these new terms compared to your original ones. You will find that the difference is negligible, particularly when you accounted for the reputational benefit of being known as a firm that treats widows fairly. She paused. This is a better arrangement for you, Mr. Holloway. You will receive full payment, with interest, and you will avoid the reputational cost of being known as a firm that preys on the vulnerable. Holloway looked at the document, at the calculations, at the woman who had just dismantled his entire business model with the efficiency of a surgeon. Then he looked at Thaddeus. Your wife, he said, should be in finance. My wife, Thaddeus said, can do anything she sets her mind to. They signed the new terms that afternoon. On the train back to Newport, Evangeline sat with the contract in her lap, looking at her signature beside Thaddeus's. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For letting me be part of this, for not simply solving it for me. He took her hand. We are partners, he said, in all things. That was the agreement. She looked at him, and he saw in her eyes what he had been seeing more and more often since the wedding. Not gratitude, trust. In December, they established the Leopold Ashford Memorial Fund, a foundation dedicated to women's education, to providing scholarships for young women who wanted to attend university but lacked the means. Evangeline had proposed it. Thaddeus had funded it. Together, they had built it into something that would outlast both of them. They held a small reception at Windermere to announce the fund. 20 guests, people who had known Leopold, people who understood what he had valued. Evangeline stood in the library and spoke about her father, about his belief in education, in rational discourse, in the fundamental equality of all minds, regardless of the body they inhabited. My father believed, she said, that the greatest tragedy of our age was wasted potential, that there were minds of extraordinary brilliance being squandered because they belonged to people who were denied access to education. She looked around the room. This fund is his legacy, and it is my hope that it will enable young women to develop their full capacities, to become not what society tells them they should be, but what their own talents and ambitions allow them to become. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Mrs. Blackwood, of all people, began to applaud, and the rest of the room followed. The announcement was published in the Newport Daily News and the Boston Globe, and somewhere Thaddeus thought Leopold Ashford was smiling. On Christmas Eve, Evangeline found a box in the library, small, wooden, with her name carved into the lid in her father's handwriting. She opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside was a letter. My dearest Evangeline, if you are reading this, you have found someone worthy, I hope, and I confess I have my suspicions about who that person is, Thaddeus Ravencroft. When I asked him to watch over you, I was not asking him to be merely your protector. I was asking him to be honest about what I saw in his eyes whenever you entered a room. I knew, a father knows. I also knew you cared for him, though you both thought you were being subtle. You were not. I did not push because some things must be chosen freely, not arranged by dying fathers with good intentions. But know this, my greatest hope was that the two of you would find your way to each other, not because of any promise or obligation, but because you are both rare souls who deserve rare happiness. 7 years seems a long time to wait, but perhaps some loves need time to grow certain of themselves. Be happy, my darling girl. Be honest. Be loved. Your father, who knew all along, Leopold. Evangeline's hands were trembling when she finished reading. Thaddeus, who had been standing in the doorway watching, crossed the room and took the letter from her hands. Read it. He knew, Thaddeus said quietly. The entire time. He knew. Evangeline was laughing through tears. We spent 7 years being careful, and he saw through us from the beginning. We were extraordinarily foolish, Thaddeus said. We were, she agreed, but we are done being foolish now. She stood and turned into his arms, and Thaddeus held her in the library where they had first talked about Wollstonecraft and Mill, where she had been 14 and asked if his book was boring, where 7 years of silence had finally broken into something true. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. Inside, in the warmth of Windermere, they were home. 5 years later, September 1900. The rose garden at Windermere Estate was in full bloom. Thaddeus Ravenscroft, now 36, stood at the window of his study and watched his wife in the garden below. Evangeline, 30 years old and more beautiful than she had been at 25, was kneeling beside their son. Leopold Ravenscroft, 3 years old, at the moment, named after the grandfather he would never meet but whose legacy he would carry. She was teaching him about roses, how they grew, how they bloomed, how patience was required for beautiful things. Leopold listened with the serious attention of a child who took his mother's words as gospel. Near the bench in a basket lined with soft blankets, their daughter slept. Adelaide Ravenscroft, 1 year old, named after Thaddeus's mother, dark hair like her mother's, eyes that promised to be the same sharp brown. Thaddeus watched them and felt something in his chest that he had no words for. Not happiness. Happiness was too small a word. This was something larger, something that encompassed the 7 years of silence and the 5 years of truth, the mistakes and the corrections, the fear and the courage it had taken to move past it. This was peace. He left the study and walked down to the garden. Leopold saw him first. Papa! The boy ran to him with the unsteady enthusiasm of someone still learning the mechanics of running. Thaddeus caught him, lifted him easily. Are you learning about roses? He asked. Mama says they need time to grow, Leopold said seriously. Like people. Your mama is very wise. Evangeline looked up at him. The sun was behind her and the light caught in her hair in a way that made her look exactly as she had 7 years ago in her father's library. Except now there was no carefulness in her expression, no guardedness, just the open, undefended warmth of a woman who knew she was loved and loved in return. He asked how you knew I was the one, she said. Thaddeus set Leopold down, crossed to where Evangeline sat on the grass. And what did you tell him? I told him to ask you. Thaddeus looked at his son, at the serious brown eyes and the expectant expression. Your mother, he said, argued with me about philosophy for 2 hours when she was 18 years old, and I rode home that night knowing I was completely lost. Leopold considered this with the gravity of someone who did not entirely understand but knew the answer was important. Did you find your way, he asked. Eventually, Thaddeus said. It took 7 years, but yes, I found my way. Evangeline stood, brushed the grass from her dress. 7 years of silence, she said quietly. But we have had 5 years of truth, and we will have 50 more. At least 50, Thaddeus said. She smiled, the real smile, the one that had taken him 7 years to earn the right to see freely. And standing there in the rose garden with their children in the afternoon sun and the whole of their life spread out before them. Thaddeus thought about his father-in-law's words. Watch over her. He had spent 7 years doing it badly, but he had spent 5 years doing it right, as her partner, her equal, her love. And their children would know that legacy mattered most when built on truth. That evening after the children were in bed, Thaddeus and Evangeline sat in the library. The same library where it had all begun, where a 14-year-old girl had asked if his book was boring, where an 18-year-old woman had argued about rights and rationality, where a man of 24 had realized he was completely lost. Read me something, Evangeline said. She was curled in the chair by the fire, the one that had always been hers even when she did not yet know it. Thaddeus pulled a book from the shelf. Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. This one, he asked. That one, she said. He sat across from her and opened to a passage near the middle, and he read to her in the firelight. The same words they had debated 7 years ago, but they sounded different now. Not because the words had changed, but because they had. When he finished, Evangeline was quiet for a moment. Then, do you ever regret it? The 7 years we lost? Thaddeus set the book down. He looked at her across the firelight, at the woman who had been worth waiting for, worth being afraid for, worth learning to be brave for. No, he said, because those 7 years made these 5 possible, and these 5 have been worth everything. She rose and crossed to him, settled into his lap with the easy familiarity of 5 years of marriage. Equal in all things, she said softly. Equal in all things, he agreed. Outside, the Newport night was clear and cool. Inside, in the library at Windermere, Thaddeus and Evangeline Ravencroft sat in the firelight, 2 rare souls who had found their way to each other. Not quickly, not easily, but truly. And that in the end was all that mattered. The Leopold Ashford Memorial Fund would go on to educate more than 200 women in its first decade. Evangeline's essays on women's property rights, published under the pseudonym E.R. Sterling, would influence policy reform in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Their children would grow up in a house where intellectual partnership was the foundation of love, where questions were encouraged, where being smart was never something to apologize for. And every September on their anniversary, Thaddeus and Evangeline would walk in the rose garden, the same garden where he had proposed, the same roses that had needed time to bloom, and they would remember 7 years of silence, 5 years of truth, and all the years that came after, built on honesty, built on partnership, built on the simple, extraordinary fact that some loves are worth the wait, even if the wait is 7 years too long.